My 10-year-old daughter burst into the delivery room and screamed, "Don't let Dad sign those papers!" Every doctor stopped moving. The nurse froze with a clipboard in her hands. My husband, David, was already reaching for the consent forms. I was barely conscious through the pain. No one expected a frightened little girl to interrupt an emergency delivery. But Lily wasn't crying because she was scared. She was terrified of what her father was about to do. She clutched a thick hospital folder against her chest and backed away before anyone could take it from her. "Please," she cried. "You have to read this first." The obstetrician stopped him before the pen touched the page. David's face lost all its color. "Lily," he said sharply, "give me the folder." She shook her head. "No." Then she said the sentence that made the entire room fall silent. "I heard you talking to your lawyer." For a moment, even the heart monitor seemed louder than anyone's breathing. Another contraction tore through my body. The room blurred. I looked from my daughter to my husband, and suddenly I wasn't afraid of losing my baby. I was afraid of the man I'd trusted for 12 years. Because whatever was inside that folder, my little girl believed it was the only thing standing between me and something far worse than childbirth. Earlier that morning, I still believed I had a happy marriage. I had no idea my emergency delivery was about to expose a plan that would destroy my family forever. For 12 years, I believed I knew exactly who my husband was. David Carter wasn't the kind of man people questioned. He coached Lily's soccer team every Saturday morning. He never forgot birthdays. He volunteered at church food drives every Thanksgiving. Neighbors waved when he drove past. Parents at Lily's elementary school called him dependable. If someone had told me back then that the man I'd trusted with my life would one day become the person I feared most, I would have laughed. My name is Emily Carter. I was 36 years old, a fourth-grade teacher outside Columbus, Ohio, and 35 weeks pregnant with our second child. Life wasn't glamorous, but it felt full. Every weekday began before sunrise. I'd pack Lily's lunch while David made coffee. He always joked that my coffee tasted like warm chocolate milk because I used too much cream. I'd roll my eyes. He'd kiss my forehead. Lily would come downstairs pretending to be half asleep until someone mentioned pancakes. Some mornings felt so ordinary that I secretly wished I could freeze them forever. After school, I'd help students who struggled with reading while David picked Lily up from soccer practice. Evenings belonged to homework, dinner, and the baby growing steadily inside me. Lily couldn't wait to become a big sister. She'd already chosen bedtime stories to read to the baby. She talked to my stomach every night. Sometimes she'd whisper secrets she refused to tell anyone else. "Don't worry," she'd say with complete seriousness. "I'll teach you how to beat Dad at Monopoly." David always laughed. "So this is how betrayal starts." Lily would grin. It already started. Moments like those made me believe we were one of the lucky families, not perfect, just solid. Looking back now, I realized something important. Families rarely fall apart overnight. Sometimes they begin breaking in places you never think to look. The first change wasn't emotional, it was financial. About 8 months before the baby was due, David became strangely protective of our paperwork. It happened so gradually that I barely noticed. One weekend, I went looking for our homeowner's insurance policy because the mortgage company needed an updated copy. "I'll find it," David said before I'd even opened the filing cabinet. "It's okay," I replied. "I know where we keep everything." I reorganized it. He smiled as he said it. Nothing about his expression seemed unusual. He disappeared into the home office for several minutes before returning with exactly the document I needed. I thanked him and moved on. A few weeks later, our accountant emailed asking for tax records. Again, David insisted on handling it himself. Then it was the car insurance renewal, our retirement statements, medical records. Even the combination to our fireproof document safe suddenly changed. "I'll take care of it" became his favorite sentence. At first, I appreciated it. Pregnancy was exhausting. Teaching 30 energetic fourth graders while carrying an extra 30 pounds left me tired enough without worrying about paperwork. So I let him manage it. Little by little, I stopped asking where things were, and David stopped volunteering the answers. Lily noticed before I did. One Saturday afternoon, she wandered into the kitchen, holding the empty key holder we kept beside the pantry. "Mom?" "Yes, sweetheart." "Where's the silver key?" "The safe key?" She nodded. I don't know. Why? Dad moved it. I smiled without looking up from the vegetables I was chopping. I'm sure he has a reason. She shrugged and skipped back outside. Children accept small changes much faster than adults. They don't immediately assume those changes mean danger. Neither did I. Around the same time, David became unusually interested in my doctor's appointments. He'd always attended the important ultrasounds. That wasn't new. What changed was that he insisted on keeping every appointment card, every test result, and every discharge summary himself. I'll file it, he'd say, slipping the papers into his leather briefcase before I could even glance through them. Once I laughed. You're acting like my personal assistant. He smiled. Somebody has to keep you organized. It sounded sweet, supportive even. If anything, I felt grateful. Pregnancy brain was real, and I was forgetting little things all the time. I never imagined organization could become another form of control. The only person who occasionally questioned David's behavior was my older sister, Rachel. Rachel worked as a critical care nurse at a different hospital across town. She'd seen enough families in crisis to notice details the rest of us ignored. One evening, after my baby shower, she watched David carefully collect every medical brochure and appointment packet before placing them into his briefcase. When he walked outside to load gifts into the car, Rachel leaned toward me. Does he always keep your medical paperwork? I laughed. He's just being helpful, she smiled politely. If you say so. That was all. She didn't argue, she didn't push. Rachel had always believed advice only worked when people were ready to hear it. Unfortunately, I wasn't ready. As we drove home that night, Lily stared quietly out the backseat window. Dad. Yeah, kiddo. Why do you keep putting Mom's hospital papers in your bag? For the first time that evening, David didn't answer immediately. He caught my eyes in the rearview mirror before smiling. So your mom doesn't have to worry about them, Lily nodded, satisfied. I nodded too, satisfied for exactly the same reason. Neither of us realized we'd just accepted the first lie that would eventually unravel our entire family. The morning everything changed began with a puddle of spilled orange juice. Lily had been reaching for her backpack when she knocked over her glass. Normally, I would have laughed and handed her a towel. Instead, a sharp pain shot across my lower abdomen. I froze. Mom? Lily asked. I'm okay. I wanted that to be true. Another cramp hit less than a minute later. Stronger. Longer. David looked up from his phone. You don't look okay. I whispered, pressing a hand against my stomach. I think something's wrong. Within 15 minutes, we were speeding toward Riverside Medical Center. I kept telling myself it had to be Braxton Hicks. False labor. Anything but the real thing. I was only 35 weeks pregnant. The baby wasn't supposed to arrive for another month. David drove with one hand on the steering wheel and the other reaching across the center console to squeeze mine. We're almost there. His voice sounded calm, steady. Exactly what I needed. When we reached the emergency entrance, nurses were already waiting with a wheelchair. The contractions had become regular by then. Every few minutes, another wave stole my breath. The triage nurse checked my blood pressure before asking David for my insurance card and identification. I have everything, he answered, before I could open my purse. He handed over a neatly organized folder. Insurance, driver's license, prenatal records, medication list, everything. The nurse smiled. I wish every family came this prepared. So do I, David replied. Looking back, that moment stayed with me, not because anything seemed wrong, because everyone, including me, mistook control for responsibility. Within the hour, I was admitted to labor and delivery. The obstetrician explained that my blood pressure was climbing, and the baby's heart rate showed signs of stress. We're going to monitor both of you very closely, she said. If things don't improve, we may need to deliver today. I nodded, trying to stay calm. David answered most of the questions before I could. When was her last meal? I know. Any medication allergies? I have the list. When did the contractions begin? I timed every one. The staff appreciated how prepared he was. So did I. Pregnancy made me tired. It felt comforting to have someone handling the details. Only one person seemed uncomfortable. Lily? She sat quietly in the corner of the room, hugging the stuffed rabbit she'd owned since kindergarten. Every so often, she'd glance toward her father instead of me, not with fear, with curiosity, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle no one else could see. A nurse asked David to retrieve one additional document from admissions before surgery could be scheduled if it became necessary. "I'll be right back," he said. He kissed my forehead and left the room carrying the leather folder. About 10 minutes later, Lily quietly slipped out after him. I assumed she was going to find a vending machine. I closed my eyes as another contraction tightened across my stomach. When Lily returned, she looked different, quieter, distracted. She climbed into the chair beside my bed without saying a word. "Everything okay?" I asked. She forced a smile. "Yeah." As nurses disconnected monitors and prepared my bed for surgery, David gathered every piece of paperwork from the bedside table. Insurance forms, admission documents, consent packets. Nothing escaped his attention. Again, I thought he was simply helping. Then I noticed Lily. She wasn't watching me anymore. She was watching her father. Every movement, every paper, every signature. As the nurses rolled my bed toward the operating suite, David paused outside the room for just a moment. He looked over both shoulders. Then, believing no one was paying attention, he quietly opened his leather folder. He removed one large manila envelope, slipped another inside, closed the folder, and walked away as though nothing had happened. Hidden around the corner, Lily saw every second of it. She didn't understand what had just happened, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her father had just replaced something. And whatever it was, he didn't want anyone else to see. Lily didn't tell anyone what she had seen. Not me, not the nurses, not even her grandmother when she arrived an hour later carrying a tote bag full of snacks. No one was hungry enough to eat. She simply watched. Children have a remarkable instinct. They can't always explain why something feels wrong, but they know when the people they trust begin acting differently. David was acting differently. He barely left the nurse's station. Every time someone walked away from the admissions desk, he seemed to drift toward the stack of medical folders waiting to be processed. Whenever a nurse approached, he stepped back with a polite smile, looking every bit like the worried husband everyone expected him to be. No one questioned him. Why would they? His wife was in premature labor. He looked frightened. He looked exhausted. He looked exactly like a man trying to hold his family together. Only Lily had seen the envelope switch. She sat quietly outside my room, hugging her backpack while watching her father pace the hallway. A few minutes later, David's phone rang. He glanced toward the nurses before answering. "I'll be right back." He walked toward a quieter hallway near the family waiting area. Without thinking, Lily followed. She wasn't trying to spy. She simply wanted to ask if she could see me before surgery. But when she reached the corner, she heard him speaking in a voice she'd never heard before, low, urgent. "She's almost in surgery." A pause. "No, she doesn't know." Another pause. "I replaced everything." Lily frowned. "Replaced what?" David rubbed his forehead. "I understand." His voice became tighter. "But if she wakes up before it's signed, the whole plan falls apart." Lily's heart began pounding. She didn't understand what the plan meant. She only knew her father had never spoken that way before. Then she heard another sentence, one she would remember for the rest of her life. "I'll sign before her sister gets here." The call ended. Lily ducked behind a vending machine just before David turned around. He walked past without seeing her. She waited until he disappeared before stepping back into the hallway. Her hands were trembling. Rachel? Mom's sister. Why was Dad worried about Aunt Rachel arriving? Something wasn't right. As she wandered back toward the waiting room, she noticed David's leather briefcase sitting alone on one of the chairs. He must have left it there after the phone call. She stared at it, then looked down the hallway. David was talking with one of the doctors. He wasn't looking. Lily knew she shouldn't touch it. Her parents had always taught her to respect other people's belongings. But another thought pushed its way into her mind. What if that's what Dad switched? Slowly, she unlatched the briefcase. Inside were neatly organized folders, insurance papers, pens, and a large manila envelope. It looked exactly like the one she'd seen earlier. She opened it just enough to peek inside. Most of the pages were filled with words she didn't understand. Medical terms, legal language, hospital forms. She was about to close it when one sentence caught her eye. It wasn't the biggest line on the page. It wasn't highlighted. But it was the only sentence she understood. If the patient becomes unable to make medical decisions. Lily stopped reading. The next few lines mentioned someone called a medical decision maker. She searched for her father's name. Instead, she noticed fresh handwriting, a signature that looked newer than the others, almost as though someone had added it recently. She didn't understand what the document meant, but she understood something much simpler. Her father had changed papers. He had lied on the phone. And whatever he wanted signed had something to do with Mom being unable to speak. Fear settled into her chest. Not the fear of a little girl worried about hospitals. The fear of a daughter who suddenly realized the adults around her weren't telling the truth. Just then, another voice interrupted her thoughts. "Can I help you, sweetheart?" Lily jumped. A gray-haired volunteer smiled kindly at her. She quickly closed the folder. I'm looking for my mom." The volunteer pointed toward labor and delivery. "I'm sure your dad knows where she is." Lily forced a smile. "Thank you." She picked up the envelope and slipped it back into the briefcase. Or at least, she thought she did. As she hurried away, one thinner folder remained tucked beneath her backpack without her noticing. Only after she reached the waiting room did she realize she was still carrying it. She stared at the hospital logo on the cover, then opened it again. This time, another page slid partially free. Across the top, in bold letters, were the words, "Advance Medical Directive." She didn't understand the legal language underneath, but one thing was suddenly clear. This wasn't an ordinary hospital form. It was important enough that her father had hidden it. At that exact moment, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Aunt Rachel. "Traffic is awful. I'll be there as soon as I can. Stay with your mom." Lily looked down at the folder in her lap, then toward the operating room doors. For the first time in her 10 years of life, she made a decision without asking an adult for permission. She wasn't going to give the folder back. Not until someone explained why her father was so desperate to keep it hidden. Emily never saw the operating room. By the time the medical team wheeled me through the double doors, another contraction had become so intense that everything beyond the bright surgical lights faded into fragments. Voices, footsteps, machines. Someone gently adjusted the oxygen mask over my face. "Emily," the anesthesiologist said, "I'm going to give you medication to help you through the surgery. Stay with me as long as you can." I nodded. That was the last clear memory I had before the medication pulled me under. Outside the operating room, life continued without me. Doctors reviewed charts, nurses prepared medications, and decisions I couldn't hear were about to determine who would speak on my behalf. David was waiting when the charge nurse stepped into the hallway. "We may need additional authorization if complications develop," she explained. "It's standard procedure." "I'm her husband," David replied immediately. "I understand." She handed him a clipboard. "We'll review everything in just a moment." David barely glanced at the papers. Instead, he looked toward the operating room doors, then toward the hallway leading to the elevators. Rachel still hadn't arrived. He checked his watch, again, and again. A few minutes later, his phone vibrated. His attorney, David answered quietly. "They're getting ready." A pause. "No, her sister isn't here yet." Another pause. "I know." His jaw tightened. "I'll make sure it's signed first." When the call ended, he slipped the phone into his pocket just as his mother walked toward him. Margaret looked frightened. "How is Emily? They're doing everything they can." She reached for his arm. "She'll be okay." "I hope so." Everything about David looked convincing. His tired eyes, his worried expression, even the slight tremor in his voice. Margaret wrapped him in a hug. "I'll pray for both of them." David closed his eyes. "Thank you, Mom." Across the waiting area, Lily watched the entire exchange. She wanted to believe her father. She really did. But the folder hidden inside her backpack felt heavier with every passing minute. She remembered the phone call. "I'll sign before her sister gets here." She remembered the switched envelope and the strange document she'd found. For the first time, she wondered if the adults she trusted most were no longer on the same side. At that moment, the charge nurse returned carrying another set of documents. "Mr. Carter," David stepped forward immediately. "I'm ready." The nurse flipped open the clipboard. "Before we proceed, I just need to confirm." A voice interrupted from down the hallway. Rachel Carter called. "She's still 20 minutes away." David didn't answer, but Lily saw something she had never seen before. Her father's shoulders relaxed, almost as though he'd just been given more time, and somehow She knew those 20 minutes mattered more than anyone else realized. Lily couldn't wait another 20 minutes. Every instinct told her that if she stayed in the waiting room, something terrible would happen before Aunt Rachel arrived. She pulled the thin hospital folder from her backpack once more. This time, she forced herself to read every word she could understand. Most of it made no sense. Medical terminology, legal language, paragraph after paragraph written for adults. Then her eyes landed on a section where several names appeared. Patient, Emily Carter, below that. Medical agent, Rachel Carter. Lily blinked. She read it again. Rachel Carter, not David Carter. Her father wasn't listed anywhere on that page. She didn't fully understand what a medical agent was, but she knew enough to realize something was wrong. If Dad was supposed to make decisions, why wasn't his name there? Another sheet slipped loose from the folder. It carried the hospital's original filing stamp from years earlier. This wasn't something that had been printed that morning. Someone had signed these papers a long time ago. A nurse hurried past. "Sweetheart, are you here by yourself?" Lily quickly closed the folder. "My dad's over there." The nurse smiled and continued walking. Lily looked toward the consultation desk. David was already speaking with the charge nurse. The clipboard was open, more forms, more signatures. Then she heard one sentence drift across the hallway. "If your wife becomes unable to make medical decisions during surgery." The rest disappeared beneath the noise of passing carts, but Lily didn't need to hear any more. Her heart began pounding. She looked down at the folder again. Rachel Carter, then back at her father. Something inside her finally clicked. Dad wasn't supposed to sign. He was trying to sign anyway. Without stopping to think, Lily grabbed the folder and started running. She sprinted past the waiting room, past the elevators, past confused visitors who stepped aside as she raced through the hallway. A security officer called after her. She didn't stop. A nurse reached for her shoulder. She slipped past. The operating suite doors were beginning to close. Lily squeezed through the narrowing gap just before they locked. Inside, doctors were preparing for surgery. The anesthesiologist stood beside my bed. Bright lights flooded the room. I drifted somewhere between consciousness and darkness. The obstetrician turned toward the circulating nurse. "Has consent been completed?" The nurse looked toward the doorway. "Her husband is right outside." David stepped forward. The clipboard was already in his hands. He uncapped the pen. "Mr. Carter," the doctor said, "please sign here." He lowered the pen toward the paper. "Stop!" The scream echoed through the operating room. Every head turned. Lily stood in the doorway, breathing so hard she could barely speak. She clutched the hospital folder against her chest. Tears streamed down her face. "Don't let Dad sign those papers." The room froze. David stared at her in disbelief. "Lily, what are you doing?" She backed away as he took a step toward her. "No." Her small hands held the folder even tighter. "He can't sign," David forced a nervous laugh. "Sweetheart, your mom needs surgery. Give me the folder." She shook her head so hard her ponytail whipped across her shoulders. "I heard you talking to your lawyer." Silence. The doctor's expression changed instantly. "What did you say?" Lily pointed directly at her father. "He said he had to sign before Aunt Rachel got here." David's face drained of color. "She's confused," he said quickly. "She's scared." "I'm not confused," Lily cried. "You switched the papers." The obstetrician slowly lowered the clipboard. The charge nurse looked from David to the folder in Lily's hands, then back again. "Mr. Carter," she said carefully, "what documents is she talking about?" For the first time since we'd arrived at the hospital, David had no answer. No one moved. For several long seconds, the only sound inside the operating room was the steady rhythm of my heart monitor. Beep, beep, beep. The obstetrician slowly held out her hand toward Lily. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "bring me the folder." David reacted first. "Lily, don't." His voice was calm, too calm. "You're frightened, and you don't understand what you're holding." "I understand enough," Lily whispered. She walked directly past him, not around him, past him, as though she no longer trusted him to stand between her and anyone else. She placed the folder into the doctor's hands. The room fell silent again. The obstetrician opened it. The first page caught her attention immediately. Her eyes narrowed. She turned to the second page, then the third. The color slowly disappeared from her face. She looked toward the charge nurse. Where did this come from? Lily answered before anyone else could. It was in Dad's briefcase. David took one step forward. My daughter found some old paperwork. It isn't relevant anymore. The doctor didn't respond. Instead, she flipped to the final page. There, beneath the hospital seal and notarized signatures, was a document she clearly recognized. Advance Medical Directive. She continued reading silently, then stopped. She looked directly at David. When were you planning to tell us about this? David blinked. I don't know what you're talking about. The doctor turned the document toward the charge nurse. Read the appointment section. The nurse's eyes scanned the page. A moment later, she looked up. Oh. The room instantly felt different. What is it? Another physician asked. The charge nurse answered quietly. Mrs. Carter appointed a medical decision-maker years ago. Every eye turned toward David. The nurse continued. And it isn't her husband. Silence. The designated medical agent is Rachel Carter. The words landed like a hammer. David's mouth opened, then closed. That's impossible. The obstetrician calmly reached for the patient's electronic chart on the nearby computer. Let's verify. She typed for several seconds. The operating room remained completely still. Then the computer chimed. Confirmed, she said. The original directive is already on file with the hospital. She looked at David. This document has been part of Mrs. Carter's permanent medical record for years. Another nurse immediately removed the clipboard from David's hands. I'm sorry, sir. David stared after it. There must be some mistake. There isn't. The obstetrician's voice became firm. If Mrs. Carter loses decision-making capacity, only the person named in this directive may provide authorization unless an emergency exception applies. David's composure finally cracked. I'm her husband. And that does not override a valid medical power of attorney. His face flushed red. I've been making every decision since we got here. You've been helping your wife, the doctor corrected. That is very different from having legal authority to make medical decisions on her behalf. Another nurse stepped closer. Doctor, the patient's blood pressure is dropping. The obstetrician nodded immediately. We can't delay any longer. She turned toward the charge nurse. Call Rachel Carter immediately. We already have her number. Tell her to come directly to operating room 2. David stepped between them. You don't have time to wait. We're not waiting. The doctor never raised her voice. We're preparing for surgery now. But any non-emergency medical decisions will be discussed with the patient's legally appointed representative. David looked around the room. No one supported him. No one handed the clipboard back. No one even looked at him the same way anymore. The image of the devoted husband had vanished in less than 2 minutes. Not because Lily had accused him. Because the paperwork proved she was telling the truth. At that exact moment, the operating room doors burst open. Rachel hurried inside, still wearing her hospital scrubs from the end of her own shift. I'm Rachel Carter. She was breathing hard. My sister, the obstetrician, walked directly toward her. Are you the person named in Emily Carter's medical power of attorney? Rachel nodded without hesitation. Yes. She reached into her wallet and handed over her identification. The doctor compared it with the directive, then nodded once. Identity confirmed. Rachel looked past the doctors and saw me lying unconscious beneath the surgical lights. Tears filled her eyes. Emily. The obstetrician gently placed a hand on her shoulder. We need to begin immediately. Rachel swallowed. Do whatever gives my sister and her baby the best chance. The doctor nodded. That's exactly what we'll do. As the surgical team moved into position, David stood alone near the wall. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, no one was asking for his permission anymore. When I opened my eyes again, the world was quiet. Not silent, just distant. The steady beep of a heart monitor reached me first, then the soft hiss of oxygen, finally the familiar smell of a hospital room. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then I felt the soreness across my abdomen, the surgery, the baby. I tried to move. Pain stopped me immediately. A nurse noticed my eyes opening. Emily, I blinked. You gave us a scare. My baby, she smiled. Your little boy is in the NICU, but he's breathing on his own. The doctors are optimistic. Relief washed over me so quickly that tears filled my eyes. And Lily? She's safe. I closed my eyes for a second. Thank God. The nurse gently adjusted my blanket. Your sister will be in shortly. I frowned. My sister? Rachel has been making medical decisions while you recovered. I smiled weakly. Of course. I barely remembered signing the medical power of attorney years earlier. It had happened after Lily was born. There had been complications during that delivery too. Rachel, being an ICU nurse, had insisted every adult should have an advance medical directive. You hope you'll never need it, she'd told me. But if you ever do, it shouldn't be left to guesswork. I had filled out the paperwork, signed it, had it notarized, then forgotten about it. I never imagined it would one day save my life. A soft knock came from the doorway. Rachel stepped inside. The moment our eyes met, she started crying. I had seen my sister comfort grieving families, remain calm during medical emergencies, work 16-hour shifts without breaking. I'd never seen her cry like this. I reached for her hand. What happened? She looked down. Emily. Her voice shook. There's something you need to know. I felt my stomach tighten. The baby? No. Lily. They're both okay. She pulled a chair beside my bed. It's David. Everything inside me froze. What about him? Rachel took a slow breath. He tried to have the hospital recognize him as your medical decision maker. I stared at her. Well, I forced a small smile. He's my husband. Not legally. The smile disappeared. Rachel continued carefully. The hospital already had your advance medical directive on file. I nodded. I remember signing it. He knew about it. My heart skipped. What? He may not have known who you appointed, Rachel said quietly. But he knew there were documents that stood in his way. I remembered flashes from before the surgery. Lily crying, doctors shouting, David reaching for paperwork. Everything felt disconnected, like pieces from someone else's dream. Rachel opened a folder she had brought with her. The charge nurse documented everything. She slid several copies onto the bed. There were witnesses, the doctors, the nursing staff, even hospital security. I looked at the pages without really seeing them. What exactly did he do? Rachel hesitated. Emily. They believe he intentionally tried to prevent the staff from reviewing your advance medical directive before asking to sign consent documents. I couldn't speak. He also removed paperwork from his briefcase after arriving at the hospital. Lily saw him. She heard him talking on the phone. My chest tightened. Lily, Rachel nodded. She saved you. Tears rolled down my cheeks before I even realized I was crying. My 10-year-old. Rachel squeezed my hand. She protected you when none of us knew you needed protecting. A gentle knock interrupted us. The obstetrician entered the room carrying my chart. She smiled kindly. I'm happy to see you awake. Thank you, I whispered. She pulled up a chair. I wanted to explain what happened while you were unconscious. I nodded. She chose her words carefully. We've completed an internal incident report. Because there were questions about legal medical authority, hospital administration has preserved all documentation and security footage. My heart pounded. So, this isn't over. She gave a small shake of her head. No. Then she looked directly at me. Mrs. Carter, in my career, I've seen families disagree. I've seen heartbreaking situations. But I've never seen a 10-year-old child stop an operating room because she believed the wrong person was about to make decisions for her mother. She smiled gently. And she was right. For the first time since waking up, I realized this wasn't simply a misunderstanding, whatever David had planned. The hospital was now treating it as something much more serious. The hospital discharged me 6 days later. Our son was still in the NICU, growing stronger every day. The doctors believed he'd be able to come home within a few weeks. That should have been the only thing occupying my thoughts. Instead, every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lily standing in that operating room, screaming for strangers not to let her father sign my paperwork. No mother ever wants that memory to belong to her child. David wasn't there when I left the hospital. By then, hospital administration had instructed him not to contact me while their investigation was ongoing. I later learned he had argued with security before finally leaving the building. I didn't see any of it. Rachel made sure of that. She drove Lily and me home herself. The house felt unfamiliar, not because anything had changed, because everything had. David's clothes were still hanging in the closet. His coffee mug still sat beside the sink. His running shoes were still by the front door, but they no longer belonged to the man I thought I had married. 2 days later, Rachel returned carrying a thick envelope. The hospital released copies of the incident report. I wasn't sure I wanted to read it, but I knew I had to. Inside were written statements from nurses, the obstetrician, the charge nurse, security officers, even the volunteer who had seen Lily carrying the folder. Each statement described the same sequence of events. David attempting to complete paperwork, Lily interrupting, the discovery of my advance medical directive, the immediate suspension of all authorization requests until Rachel arrived. One paragraph made my hands tremble. Security footage confirmed David had removed documents from his briefcase shortly before surgery. Another camera showed him replacing papers inside the hallway outside labor and delivery. I hadn't imagined it. He'd actually done it. Rachel quietly placed another document in front of me. What is this? A financial disclosure. I looked up. How did you get it? Your attorney. My attorney, Rachel gave me a sad smile. I thought it would be wise to call one. I unfolded the papers. At first, none of it made sense. Credit cards, personal loans, business debts, legal notices. Then I saw the total amount. Over $600,000. I stopped breathing for a moment. This can't be right. Rachel nodded slowly. It is. I stared at the pages. We never had this kind of debt. You didn't. The words barely registered. What do you mean? He never told you. Over the next hour, the truth emerged piece by piece. David had secretly invested in a commercial property with 2 business partners. The project failed. The bank demanded repayment. Then one partner sued him, claiming David had concealed financial losses before they invested additional money. Court hearings were only weeks away. If he lost, everything we owned could be at risk. The house, our savings, our retirement accounts, everything. I buried my face in my hands. Why didn't he tell me? Rachel answered softly. Because then you'd have had a choice. That sentence hurt more than everything else. Marriage is supposed to survive hard conversations. Instead, David had built an entirely different life without me ever knowing. The next visitor surprised me even more. Margaret, David's mother. She stood on my porch holding a casserole dish neither of us cared about. The moment I opened the door, she burst into tears. I am so sorry. I invited her inside. She sat at the kitchen table for several minutes before speaking again. I defended him, her voice cracked. I thought everyone was misunderstanding. She looked directly at me. Then I saw the hospital report. I didn't interrupt. I confronted David. What did he say? Margaret closed her eyes. He admitted he was desperate. A lump formed in my throat. He said if something happened to you. She couldn't finish. I already knew. He believed he could protect the house. The words sounded almost impossible to hear aloud. Margaret nodded. He convinced himself he was saving his family. But he wasn't. No, she wiped away fresh tears. He was saving himself. Silence settled between us. Finally, she reached across the table and took my hand. I raised him. I love him. But what he did, she shook her head, has no excuse. For reasons I still can't explain, hearing those words from his own mother gave me peace. Not because they erased the betrayal, because they reminded me that truth doesn't belong to one side. Even the people who love someone most can recognize when they've crossed a line. 3 weeks later, detectives asked to meet with me. The hospital had referred the incident to law enforcement because the suspected document tampering involved medical records and legal authorization. One investigator placed several photographs on the table. Security camera images, David switching folders, David removing papers, David speaking on the phone moments before surgery. We're still reviewing everything, the detective explained. But based on the evidence, we believe your daughter prevented a very serious fraud. I thought about Lily. She was outside coloring pictures for her baby brother. She had no idea adults were calling her brave. She still worried more about math homework than court hearings. And I silently thanked God for that. Sometimes children save lives without ever realizing how close they came to losing the people they love. As the detective gathered his files, he paused at the door. Mrs. Carter, you should know something. If your daughter hadn't spoken up when she did, He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, because by then, I already understood exactly what she had saved me from. 6 months later, our house sounded different, not quieter, happier. Our son, Noah, had developed a habit of laughing every time Lily made ridiculous animal noises. She took that responsibility very seriously. Every afternoon after school, she'd rush through the front door, wash her hands, and race to his playpen. "Report for duty," she'd announce. Noah would immediately start kicking his little feet. For the first time in months, our home felt like a place where children belonged. Not lawyers, not investigators, not fear. The legal process moved far more slowly than life did. I filed for divorce shortly after leaving the hospital. David eventually accepted a settlement rather than forcing Lily to testify in open court. The criminal investigation continued separately. Hospital officials confirmed that their records had never been altered, which protected the validity of my advance medical directive. The surveillance footage, witness statements, and recovered documents told the rest of the story. Whether David had intended to save himself from financial ruin or convinced himself he was protecting the family no longer mattered. Choices still have consequences. His did too. I rarely asked Rachel about the investigation anymore. At some point, I realized I didn't need every answer to move forward. I only needed to know my children were safe. Margaret continued visiting every few weeks. She never defended her son's actions again. Instead, she showed up with homemade soup, read books to Noah, and quietly rebuilt her relationship with Lily one afternoon at a time. Healing, I learned, doesn't always happen through grand apologies. Sometimes it arrives through small acts repeated over and over until trust slowly grows back. One Saturday morning, Lily and I stopped by the park after Noah's pediatric checkup. He had finally been discharged from all specialized follow-up care. The doctor smiled as we left. "He's doing exactly what we'd hoped." Those words stayed with me all afternoon. Lily pushed Noah on the baby swing while I watched from a nearby bench. The sunlight caught her face as she laughed. Not the nervous, frightened smile I'd seen in the hospital. The carefree laugh of a 10-year-old who was finally allowed to be 10 again. After a while, she wandered over and sat beside me. "Mom? Yeah? Can I ask you something?" "Always." She looked toward her little brother. "Do you think Noah will remember any of this?" I smiled. "No." She let out a long breath. "Good." "Why good?" "Because I want his first memories to be happy ones." I slipped my arm around her shoulders. "I want that too." For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Children ran across the playground. Parents called them in for lunch. Somewhere nearby, an ice cream truck played the same cheerful song it had probably been playing for decades. Life had continued while ours had fallen apart. Now, little by little, we were catching up. As we walked back to the car, Lily reached for my hand. She hadn't done that in years. I squeezed it gently. "You know," I said, "there's something I've never thanked you for." She looked confused. "For what?" "For trusting your heart when the adults around you didn't." She shook her head. "I wasn't brave. I was just scared," I smiled. The two aren't opposites. Most brave people are scared. They just choose to do the right thing anyway. She thought about that for a moment before grinning. "So, does that mean I don't have to unload the dishwasher today?" I laughed harder than I had in months. "Nice try." She groaned dramatically. It was worth asking. As we pulled into the driveway, Noah had already fallen asleep in his car seat. Lily quietly gathered her backpack before following me inside. The afternoon sunlight spilled across our front porch. The same porch where I'd once believed a perfect family lived. Now I knew something better. Perfect families don't exist. Honest ones do. And honesty, even when it arrives through heartbreak, gives you something fear never can. A chance to begin again.